Hey nerds, what's up? Is no ending worse than a bad ending? We are lucky enough in the fantasy fandom to have a very interesting case study with A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. On the one hand, we have the book series, which has been in limbo for 14 years.
Now, the only problem is that The Winds of Winter and Dream of Spring have yet to be published, so those aren't available. No. Well, I can't do anything about what I can't control.
That is total bull. George R.R. Martin was supposed to deliver The Winds of Winter to his publisher over 2 years ago.
I know that was the original deadline. That's what it says here. But I'm reading to you from the Wikipedia page. It also says that Martin had a grueling promotion schedule or something, and it's interfered with his writing schedule. He's failed to complete The Winds of Winter.
That don't make no sense.
Or, on the other hand, the Game of Thrones TV show, which had a season 8 that was largely disliked, to put it mildly, by fans. So which is better? Well, that's a complicated question that we'll have to answer later in this video because, of course, I want to start by looking at some research. And yes, overall, quite definitively, research shows that people tend to put a much larger emphasis on endings than anything else. A quick caveat before we jump straight into this research. As you know, if you've been on this channel, I always give a caveat to all research. These studies do have some design flaws on top of the fact that in general, psychology studies already suffer from results that are notoriously difficult to measure and quantify. On top of that, these studies in particular suffer from an incredibly homogeneous demographic. All of these studies were only conducted on men in a limited age group. So that said, I think these are really interesting as a starting off point for discussion and general trends, but we shouldn't take them as like die-hard facts. The biggest psychological effect when talking about endings is something that they call the peak end rule, which is that people remember endings and extremes more than anything else. The metaphor constantly used in this research was that of a 5-day beach vacation. They posited that in general, people would vastly prefer a vacation where the first 3 or 4 days were terrible and rainy, but the last day was really positive, to a vacation where the first 3 days were incredible and the last 2 days were rainy and negative. That despite the fact that the second vacation was overall much better, people's emphasis on endings means that experiences that end well are experiences they view more favorably, even if overall they weren't as favorable. This was studied in a variety of ways, but one way in particular that was interesting to me is that they had doctors perform undesirable procedures like colonoscopies and study different reactions to them. During the study, they found that patients' perception of the overall procedure were vastly influenced by the peak pain, part of the peak end, and the ending experience. So they found that procedures that were shorter but stayed a consistent pain level overall were viewed more negatively than procedures that were longer but had less pain at the end. So even if the peak pain in that longer procedure was higher than the first shorter procedure, patients always preferred the procedure where the end got better, even if it was longer. So that led doctors to believe that prolonging a procedure and making sure that there is some release of pain at the end could have more positive outcomes for patients, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense logically. This was also studied with other types of things that didn't involve pain at all, like gambling, with the same results, that people always put a disproportional amount of emphasis on endings. One explanation for this is something we're all intimately familiar with, which is the term recency bias. That's something we use a lot. It's known that more recent experiences in our brain tend to loom larger and are recalled more quickly or fondly, easier to remember because it's the closest thing that's happened to us. Another explanation I found that feels particularly relevant to today's discussion was that there is something called a difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self. I hope you don't mind me reading a slightly longer quote from an article titled "Living and Thinking About It: Two Perspectives on Life" by Daniel Kahneman and Jason Rise, as I think it does a great job of describing this phenomenon. An individual's life could be described, at impractical length, as a string of moments. What happens to these moments? The answer is straightforward. With very few exceptions, they simply disappear. The experiencing self that lives each of these moments barely has time to exist. When we are asked, how good was the vacation? It is not an experiencing self that answers, but a remembering and evaluating self, the self that keeps score and maintains records. Unlike the experiencing self, the remembering self is relatively stable and permanent. It is a basic fact of the human condition that memories are what we get to keep from our experience, and the only perspective that we can adopt as we think about our lives is therefore that of the remembering self. For an example of the biases that result from the dominance of the remembering self, consider a music lover who listens raptly to a long symphony on a disc that is scratched near the end, producing a shocking sound. Such incidents are often described by the statement that the bad ending ruined the whole experience. But in fact, the experience was not ruined, only the memory of it. The experience of the symphony was almost entirely good, and the bad end did not undo the pleasure of the preceding half hour. The confusion of experience with memory that makes us believe a past experience can be ruined is a compelling cognitive illusion. The remembering self is sometimes simply wrong. I love this idea. It was very revolutionary to me to think of that, because how often have we, including myself, used the, that ruined the entire thing. And this idea of the difference between what we remember and what we're actually experiencing. And we've all had that happen. Like, think of you and your family at the table recalling a childhood experience and how vastly sometimes memories of the event differ and can even cause contention over the way we process things. This is also particularly relevant to the fact that we've talked about that research shows we prioritize endings. So, back to A Song of Ice and Fire. This video was really born from the inescapable amount of comments I've gotten on every single A Song of Ice and Fire video that just say, I don't know why you bother, it's never going to have an ending, or even calling me irresponsible for continuing to recommend A Song of Ice and Fire with the knowledge that it will never have an ending. Well, based on research and apparently the common personality, they're right. It's just that I don't agree. Several years ago, I was about to read a book that several people had said had a fantastic ending. And my husband was like, you're not gonna like this book as much as everyone else because you have never forgiven a book that you didn't like very much just because it had a good ending. And he's talked a lot over the years about how he feels like that is so different from my reading experiences. He says, I have never read anything where a fantastic ending erased everything else. And I never noticed it until he told me that. And once it was pointed out to me, I realized it was so true. So many conversations I've had with people in the book community will talk about, man, that ending just made everything better, 5 stars. And like, I can't do it. A book will always reflect my entire experience. If things were not going well in the beginning and middle, a fantastic ending might bump it up a little bit, but it can never be the end-all be-all, which I guess is just kind of like an unpopular feeling based on research and my experience. To be honest, I didn't really think that hard about it when I started A Game of Thrones. Sure, I wasn't expecting to fall so deeply in love with A Game of Thrones as I did, but, and I did give it thought. I thought, okay, if I start this, I have to be okay that it's never gonna have an ending, and I asked, will I care if it's not finished? And I just thought, no. And it turns out I was right. For myself, anyway. If you've been following my journey, you'll know that A Song of Ice and Fire has been one of the most incredible and special and like life-changing reading experiences for me in decades, and is definitely considered like, I include it in the top reading experiences of my life, with only a couple other really special series. And so no, not having an ending isn't going to change that. Now, I recognize I had a huge advantage. I got into A Song of Ice and Fire when I already got to make the choice to know that there wasn't going to be an ending. I am not telling fans that they have no right to be bitter or angry that something they have waited for years is unlikely to happen. I completely understand that emotion. But what I am wondering is if some of those fans haven't read the series in so long that they are allowing this bitter part of the ending to completely cloud the entire experience they had with A Song of Ice and Fire in the first place. Is your remembering self saying, it ruined the whole series for me, actually true? Because I can't count how many comments or DMs I've gotten since starting this journey that say something like, your reviews convinced me to reread A Song of Ice and Fire, and I remembered why I loved them so much. Thank you for helping me remember what I fell in love with in the first place. So I guess my point is, I'm just gonna die on the hill that no ending really just isn't the end of everything. Journey before destination, Radiant. Or is that the wrong video for this? Okay, but that's not really the question I asked in the beginning, is it? Is no ending better than a bad ending? For me, yes. I'd rather have no ending than a bad ending. For many others, no. Because I also equally have gotten a lot of comments that said, I like the show because at least it had an ending. Literally saying, I might not have liked the ending, but at least it had one. I've had no desire to watch the show because I am personally more affected by on-screen violence than I am by violence that is written, so I just know I probably wouldn't be able to handle the show. But I can't deny that if the post-book seasons were like acclaimed and everyone was like, it was incredible, the best ending to a show ever, like, would that have influenced me to watch the show? No denying, absolutely. But because no one seems to really like it, I'm just like, well, I'd rather just have no ending. My question for you is, how do you think Game of Thrones would have been perceived if they decided to stop the show when the book stopped? So they said, we have no more content. We're just gonna have to wait till Winds of Winter comes out. I hope you guys have enjoyed the show. Do you think it would be perceived differently with that no ending? How would that have affected the show's legacy? I don't know if I can answer that. I actually don't think that it having week later seasons really hurt the reputation of the show. From an outsider, I still think Game of Thrones is considered the peak of fantasy television and what everyone is trying to meet and create. So to me, it does not seem that it's really hurt its legacy at all that it had a bad ending. Maybe a little bit. I think it has certainly changed the conversations around the show maybe in a more negative way. It could also be contrasted with the books not being finished. If the books had been finished and ended better, that also would have been a complicated legacy changer. You know, you can look at TV shows that have been canceled, like I'm thinking Firefly, and other shows of that ilk that gained like huge followings, and it was like they were canceled before their time, and so not having an ending, I know they got a movie and that example was a bad example, not having an ending didn't matter. That, of course, is complicated because in that case, it becomes the fans and the creator against the big bad who canceled them. Whereas having no ending in this case, it's like fans versus George R.R. Martin, because people aren't like, no one else, no outside force canceled your books, you just didn't write them. It's kind of a thought experiment we can't answer, but I do think it leads to interesting questions. We do have a couple other examples we can pull from the fantasy book genre of these cases, and I was thinking in particular of the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss and also the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, an example of no ending and a bad ending. We have the Kingkiller Chronicles, which just almost as infamously as Game of Thrones is not going to be finished. And this is another actually just a point for like, I just don't care. I read those when I thought the book was still coming out. Like I read those before the third one was first slated to be released back in like 2014 or something. And I've moved on. It's just like, it's fine. But that obviously has a ton of negativity around it, that he'll never write it. I think that falls similarly with Song of Ice and Fire. People don't feel like you should recommend it. People are really feeling like it's not going to be finished. But then we have something like the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, which I read the first 4 books of. Basically, the first 2 were fantastic. 3 kind of was a dip in quality. 4 was like a bigger dip in quality, but it was kind of like, oh, that's, 5 can really bring it home. When 5 came out, I had read all 4 books before 5 came out, and by the time 5 did come out, I was like, oh, I kind of need to reread these books. I don't remember enough. So I didn't read 5 right away, like I normally would. And then all of a sudden, all the reviews started coming in, and everyone was hating it. So I actually ended up never reading book 5. But I've just noticed like nobody recommends the Lightbringer series anymore. And I personally feel like back when the books were still coming out, like especially between books 3 and 4, I feel like everyone was talking about that. In fairness, I wasn't online. I didn't have this online presence, but I just feel like that was a common recommendation and it was something we talked about a lot. And then after book 5 was like pretty trashed, I just never really hear people talking about that anymore. No one's ever asked me if I've read it anymore. Like, it kind of just disappeared. And it was like the bad ending really killed it. Now, again, with Song of Ice and Fire, it's all speculation. If he released his books and it was a bad ending, would that be more damaging than it currently is standing unfinished? What about when the authors eventually pass away? Will that change when there's no longer an opportunity for those books to be finished? Will the anger finally dissipate and it'll be more like this is just a thing that is? Those are questions we can't answer. Since I know I'm going to get comments that are like, well, when Martin dies, we can finish the series. Someone else will do it, just like Sanderson in Wheel of Time. Martin has gone on record as specifically not wanting this to happen. And so I personally hope that his estate honors those wishes and that nobody else finishes A Song of Ice and Fire. However, the answer to my beginning question, the answer from the research and from what I can tell is the majority opinion is that a bad ending is preferable to no ending. I just think y'all are wrong. And according to that one research paper, it's also kind of just like illogical to erase all of your positive experiences for just a negative ending. But hey, we can't always agree, can we? If you like these kind of deep dives and weird research videos into fantasy meta topics, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. Most of you aren't subscribed, so if you think you want more Song of Ice and Fire content or anything else I do, please do that. And if you want to see what I am currently reading or other nerdy rants, you can check me out on my Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.